So 8-digit PDX here. What I'm going to do is show you a couple of survival tools that we're going to do a side-by-side comparison with. Some people consider these things competitors. Other people would say, hey, if you're going to be really doing a serious survival bug out type situation, you should be in a group and you should complement each other's equipment. Unlike vehicles, firearms, certain electronics, we don't really care about compatible parts when it comes to cutlery, axes, knives, shovels, all that kind of stuff. We're not going to be swapping parts. You learn how to use one, you swap for a day, you learn how to use the other. There's no need for these things to all be uniform. But you are going to make some choices on what your preferences are, and we're going to help narrow some of those down with an informative video. Today, what we're going to look at is the Ontario Spec-Plus SPAX and the Cold Steel Kukri. Now, these are both legitimate choices for people in similar situations. I'm not going to say majorly different situations, but we're going to be doing a comparison between the two, and you can make your own decisions on which ones are going to be in your bug out bags. Now, for my situation, I'm going to probably use both for bug out bags, which are for different situations. Alright, so as we look at these in different situations, they are pretty similar. They're both going to be chopping tools, not so much slashing tools. And the Kukri has a history as a weapon. The Ontario SPAX has a history as an invention, I believe, out of Rex Applegate during World War II, but it's been modified and upgraded with some design improvements. That's one of the reasons it's part of the Ontario Spec-Plus product line. They have an improved handle on here and a few additional tools. Now, with the Kukri, if we come in on this is one of the newer models from Cold Steel that's actually made from relatively high-grade sheet metal. It's simply laser cut or plasma cut out of sheet metal. They put a reasonably decent garden tool style edge on that, and they call it a piece of equipment. Would it last a long time? Probably not as long as the older models or more deluxe models, but having dealt with the original Nepalese Kukris, I can tell you they're not that good. Okay, those things are built over a campfire. They are not that good. So the Cold Steel one's pretty good, but there are heavier ones which are a little more suited for chopping. This one's a little bit more machete-like, and it is suitable for chopping. I found that, let's say in the Southwest, in Florida, where you have a lot of soft type materials that are not totally green, this is perfectly good for chopping, let's say in Florida, Louisiana, a lot of these softer, reedy type materials, bamboo, stuff like that. This thing's going to work pretty well. When you're dealing with hardwood, you want a little more weight up front. You want a little more chopping area. And so in the Pacific Northwest, it's okay. In the Northeast, where you have a lot of maple, ash, and hardwoods, you might find this thing is just too delicate to be of use. And one of the things that's going to happen is if you chop hardwoods with this, and then it torques a little bit to the side, it'll take little divots out of your blade. And that's where the Canadians, I think, favor this sort of a thing, because there's different types of woods, either frozen pine or hardwoods like Canadian maple. And this is where it's something that's much more axe-like. Now, personally, I don't have a whole lot of use for an axe in the field. Now, there are some newer models that do tomahawk stuff. People argue about their use as a melee weapon, a short-range type weapon. Pluses and minuses on that, but we look at this, this is an axe, and then we've got this wedge type of thing. Now, some people could use this as a weapon, but if you were to optimize this as a weapon, you would need this thing to stick straight out and be longer, a lot like the spike edge of a tomahawk. But this sort of a thing is also good as a wrecking bar, because, and we'll show on the log here, let's say we're trying to debark this log, and we can hook some of that bark with this, and we can push that off using the hook. Now, we have to avoid injury and not have that thing come back on a leg. So this, you could have it sharp, or you could have it not super sharp, but it's basically like a prying tool. And we can use that to debark a log, and you can get a little bit more precision hacking. The other thing people would use these for is notching a log. Let's say if they're building little traps or little things like that. You can do precision chopping with this, which you're not really going to want to do with your knife. The front side, of course, is like a hatchet. Now, You can split small wood or something like this. But here's your problem. When you go to split small wood, a lot of people are going to be wanting to do this and say, oh yeah, we're going to split wood. Well, you know, what happens if you hit your hand? Now, if you're wearing gloves, you're a little bit safer. But this is generally not where we want to go with something like this, because if you risk injury, a small injury in a survival situation can become a really big problem. But shelter building, you may want to get rid of some of these little things on the wood and take that off. This thing's perfectly useful for this. If we do this with a kukri, you know, we can, but if it's harder wood, on the cold steel kukri, it's very sharp. This wood has gotten soft because it was rotten and dead, but if it's harder wood, you can do that thing where it's going to break some of those little pieces out of your edge. So it's comparable, but this is going to be more machete-like. If you're trying to chop really green stuff, it just works far better with than a hatchet. Getting back to the Ontario SPAX, you'll notice this hole, this kind of odd-shaped hole in the middle of the handle. This actually serves a few different purposes. And this is where I think it's more useful for the urban survivor or somebody who's bugging out from an urban area. This is actually part of a 5-sided wrench. What these angles are is a 5-sided wrench that's used on fire hydrants. And the bar wrench is used on water and gas lines. Now, here's the thing about those water and gas lines. A lot of times they're down in a thing in the ground, in a housing, where you can't get the full length of the tool. You can't bring the full leverage of the tool to bear, so it's not going to fit in some of those things. If it's on the outside of a building, this bar thing has enough leverage at this little part of the square, not on the other parts of the square, to get onto the bar thing on a gas line and turn that off to make that building safer. In the event of an earthquake or something like that, that's where you kind of want something like this. And of course, on a fire hydrant on and off, this can get the caps on, it can turn a fire hydrant on and off, but the tool is not long enough to get a really stiff fire hydrant nozzle open or closed. Okay, so to really open and close a fire hydrant with this, you would have to find some kind of a cheater bar or extension bar or whack this with a hammer to get it to turn. You would expect those things to be pretty tight, stiff, rusted shut. But it will be the leverage tool, which is impossible to improvise. It is impossible to improvise a good, usable fire hydrant wrench. And they're both relatively portable, but this is a little bit more useful as an axe. It's a little bit more useful as a rescue tool in a urban survival, post-disaster type situation. As a weapon, I would say it's a little bit less useful, so it's a little bit less threatening to people who might be confiscating weapons at a checkpoint. You know, let's say you're checking in someplace at a shelter or something like that. This is more of a tool than a weapon. When we look at the Cold Steel Kukri, it has a tradition as a medieval style weapon. So they may consider this a weapon, but the Cold Steel version has been optimized more as a machete than anything else, but it can serve as a stabbing implement, and that's one of the reasons these are restricted in the UK and in a few other countries. These are restricted because it would serve as a stabbing instrument. If you were to cut the tip off and make this not a stabbing instrument, well, one, you're getting pretty close to what the SPAX is, but it's still relatively useful for its intentional or original purpose. So if you really wanted to save size and weight or something, you could cut the tip off. Of course, it loses its utility as a stabbing instrument, but it could become a pry bar. It could become, it's still useful as a chopping tool or a machete. So when you make a personal choice on these, that's what you're looking at. As far as optimizing either one, the Ontario Spec-Plus has grooves in it, so it could accept paracord, but the handle's pretty thick and rubberized. I really wouldn't modify it in any way. The Cold Steel Kukri, you know, maybe add a lanyard. One comes with the Ontario. You might want to add a lanyard or a D-ring or something like that. Personal preference on that sort of a thing. It is something that you pretty much have to store in a sheath in order to maintain its utility. It's relatively sharp. It's not something you're going to want bouncing around in the vehicle or kept without the sheath. So they do give you a fairly good quality sheath. The SPAX also comes usually with a good quality sheath, but sometimes you're going to end up without a sheath with these things. And if you end up without a sheath of this thing, it's not really the end of the world. It can go in a toolbox. If it gets a little dull bouncing around other tools, it's still going to be relatively useful for a lot of its purposes. The pry bar, the wrench, the gas line wrench, the axe. Doesn't have to be super deadly sharp to be useful, but you'll want it to be relatively sharp. And you could pretty much do all of your sharpening with a Leatherman tool. The Cold Steel Kukri, you want to do some relatively careful sharpening with this type of thing. I prefer 1000 grit sandpaper for doing razor edges on these, but when you do that, you're going to lose that edge in a hurry too. It just goes with the territory. Both of these tend to be in the $25 to $50 range. There's a wide price difference depending on what retailer you deal with or where you get one at any given time. Whether it's personal preference, kind of depends on your situation. Backwoods in the south, warm temperate weather, I think it's this. Northwoods and urban environments and cold weather, I think it's this. So you may want to actually swap these out. Swap out, for example, which bags you're going to use seasonally, or which bug out vehicle, or however your situation is going to go.